The air in the assembly hall was thick with the scent of wilting hope and cheap perfume. It was a place for women like her, women with good names and empty purses, paraded like livestock for men who required a respectable wife without the inconvenience of a powerful family. Elara Vance stood near the cold stone hearth, her spine straight, her gaze fixed on a crack in the marble. She had been here for 3 weeks, and each day had chipped another piece from her resolve. Then the room fell silent. Not a gradual hush, but a sudden, sharp intake of breath, as if a wolf had walked into a pen of lambs. He stood in the doorway, a figure of stark black against the pale afternoon light. The Duke of Blackwood, Alistair Beaumont, a man whose name was a whispered legend of ruin and retreat. He was taller than she'd imagined, his shoulders broad beneath a perfectly tailored coat that seemed to absorb the light around it. Scars, faint white lines, mapped one side of his jaw, disappearing into a neatly trimmed black beard. His eyes, a startlingly pale grey, swept the room with an unnerving lack of interest. They dismissed the hopeful, the frightened, the desperate, until they landed on her. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. He did not smile. He did not incline his head. He simply began to walk, his boots echoing on the polished floor, a sound that seemed to count down the final seconds of her old life. He walked directly to her, his gaze never leaving her face. The other women shrank away, creating a circle of empty space around them. He stopped a pace before her, his stillness more intimidating than any movement. "You," he said. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of warmth or inflection. It was the sound of gravel settling. "Miss Vance, you will do." It was not a proposal. It was a statement of acquisition. The proprietress of the establishment, Mrs. Albright, scurried forward, her face a mask of avarice and awe. "Your Grace, an excellent choice. Miss Vance is of the finest stock, gently bred and—" He raised a single gloved hand, and she fell silent. His eyes remained on Elara. "My solicitor will call on you this afternoon, madam. Have her things packed. She leaves within the hour." He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod, not to her, but to the space she occupied. Then he turned and walked out as abruptly as he had entered. The silence he left behind was heavier than the one he had broken. Elara stood frozen, the Duke's words hanging in the air like frost. "You will do." She was a tool selected for a purpose, a key for a lock, a solution to a problem she could not begin to comprehend. A carriage door slammed shut in the street outside, the sound a final, definitive period on the last chapter of her life. The great, dark door of Blackwood Manor was opening. We hope you'll join us for this story of loss and reclamation. Subscribe for more tales like this, and please let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Before Blackwood, there was Oakhaven, a house that had once been grand, but was now crumbling under the weight of her father's debts and her stepmother's ambitions. Elara's world had been one of numbers. From the age of 15, she had been the uncredited master of the estate, her mind a fortress of ledgers, crop yields, and tenant contracts. In the dim light of her father's study, she would find the shillings and pence to keep them afloat, her neat columns of ink a silent testament to a competence no one ever acknowledged. Her father, a man faded by failure, would sign where she indicated. Her stepmother, Beatrice, would sweep in afterward, pluck the household accounts from her desk, and present them at dinner as her own triumph of frugality. One must be so clever with tradesmen. Beatrice would sigh, while Elara ate her cold mutton in silence. Her two stepsisters, Lavinia and Rosamond, would titter behind their hands, their gazes sliding over Elara as if she were a piece of worn furniture. Her one hope had been Lord Ashworth, a handsome, confident man with a title that far outstripped his character. Their engagement was a business transaction, her father's last gamble. Elara had tried to believe it could be more. She'd listened to his talk of politics and horses, offering quiet, intelligent observations that he would later repeat in company as his own. She'd allowed herself to imagine a life of shared purpose, a home where her mind would be an asset, not a secret. It was a foolish girlhood dream. The end came not with a bang, but with the clink of a wine-glass at a dinner party. Lord Ashworth sat beside her, his knee not quite touching hers. Her father cleared his throat, his face florid. He announced, with a voice thick with false regret, that the family's financial position had become untenable. The debts were being called in, and as a consequence, the engagement between his daughter and Lord Ashworth was, regrettably, dissolved. Elara looked at Ashworth. He was studying his wine, swirling the dark liquid in his glass, his expression one of mild boredom. He did not look at her. He did not offer a word of comfort or regret. He had simply assessed a failing investment and cut his losses. The guests murmured with practiced sympathy. Beatrice placed a theatrical hand to her breast, her eyes glinting with triumph. In that moment, Elara was no longer a daughter or a fiancée. She was a liability. Within a week, her bags were packed. Her stepmother informed her that an arrangement had been made. A place in London. An assembly for young ladies in her situation. "It is the best we can do for you," Beatrice said, her tone making it clear that Elara deserved far less. The only kindness was a small, heavy pouch pressed into her hand by her younger half-sister Clara in a darkened hallway. "He was never good enough for you," Clara whispered, her eyes filled with a helpless fury Elara could not afford to feel herself. Elara had taken the coins, her heart a cold, hard stone in her chest. She had learned the value of things. A promise was worth nothing. A title was worth something, but cold, hard currency was the only thing a woman alone could truly count on. The journey to Blackwood Manor was made in a carriage of unnerving luxury and absolute silence. The leather seats were cool against her skin, the suspension so perfectly balanced she felt as though she were floating through the darkening countryside. The Duke was not with her. A severe, silent footman had handed her in, and she had been alone ever since, watching the rolling hills and tidy farms of the south give way to the stark, wind-swept moors of the north. Blackwood was not a house. It was a fortress, a granite statement of defiance against the sky. It rose from the moorland, its towers stark and joyless, its windows like vacant eyes. There were no welcoming lights, only a single lamp burning over a massive iron-studded door. The door opened into a hall of cathedral-like proportions, all dark wood, cold stone, and silence. The air was chilled, smelling faintly of beeswax and rain. A woman stood waiting, as severe and unyielding as the house itself. She was dressed in black bombazine, a thicket of keys at her waist. "I am Mrs. Gable," she said, her voice crisp. "The housekeeper. His Grace is in the study. This way." She led Elara down a long corridor, their footsteps the only sound. Portraits of grim-faced ancestors watched them pass, their painted eyes seeming to judge her plain wool dress and worn travelling cloak. The study was a cavern of books, shadows, and the scent of old leather. A fire crackled in a hearth large enough to roast an ox, but it did little to warm the room. The Duke of Blackwood stood by the window, looking out at the encroaching night. He turned as they entered, his face half in shadow. "Leave us," he said to Mrs. Gable, who vanished with a quiet curtsy. He did not invite Elara to sit. He remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back. "Miss Vance," he began, his tone the same as it had been in the assembly hall, flat, factual, devoid of emotion. "I will be plain. This is not a marriage in the conventional sense. It is a contract. My grandfather's will contains a clause requiring me to be wed by my 30th birthday to secure the entirety of the Beaumont fortune. That birthday is in 2 months. I require a duchess. You require a home. This is the extent of our arrangement." He paused, his pale eyes meeting hers. "You will be mistress of this house. You will have a generous allowance. You will want for nothing material. In return, you will manage my household, comport yourself with dignity, and you will not ask for what I am unable to give." He let the words hang in the air. "I will not offer you my companionship, my confidence, or my affection. My life is my own, as yours will be your own. We will share a roof and a name. Nothing more. Do you understand the terms?" Elara looked at this cold, damaged man, at the fortress he had built around himself, and called a home. She thought of her stepmother's saccharine cruelty, of Lord Ashworth's casual disdain. Cold indifference was a language she understood. It was honest. It was clean. It was, in its own way, safe. "Indifference is a luxury I have not known, Your Grace," she replied, her voice steady. "I understand the terms perfectly." For the first time, a flicker of something surprise, perhaps, crossed his features. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Very well. Mrs. Gable will show you to your rooms. They are in the east wing. Mine are in the west. We will take breakfast together at 8. Punctually." He turned back to the window. A clear dismissal. The contract was sealed. In the first weeks, the silence of Blackwood was Elara's constant companion. It was a living thing, pooling in the vast corridors and settling over the dust-sheeted furniture in the shuttered south wing. Her rooms in the east wing were spacious and comfortable, but strangely impersonal, as if no one had truly lived in them for a generation. A young maid named Mary was assigned to her, a quiet girl with watchful eyes and gentle hands, who laid out her clothes and brought her hot water without a word, her silence a gift of comfortable space rather than judgment. Elara quickly learned the rhythms of the house. The Duke was a creature of rigid habit. Breakfast at 8 was a silent affair at opposite ends of a cavernous dining table. He would read his letters, she would sip her tea. A curt nod was their only communication. After, he would disappear into his study, or ride out across the moors, returning only for dinner, another silent meal, before retreating to the west wing. He was a ghost in his own home, and she, the new ghost-keeper. But Elara was not made for idleness. She had survived by being useful, and she did not know how to be anything else. She asked Mrs. Gable for the household ledgers. The housekeeper's eyebrows rose a fraction, but she produced them. A chaotic jumble of overpriced suppliers, late payments, and vague accounting. Elara set to work in a small morning room, its windows overlooking a vast, derelict garden. For a week she did nothing but trace the estate's financial bleeding. She found redundancies, exploitative contracts, and simple waste. On the 8th day she sent a note to the Duke's study, requesting a brief meeting. He received her with an air of impatient curiosity. She did not prevaricate. She laid out the corrected ledgers, pointing to the inflated costs from the local corn chandler, the exorbitant price for household linens, the inefficient ordering of coal. By renegotiating these 3 accounts alone, she stated, you will save the estate over £200 a year. He looked from the ledgers to her face, his expression unreadable. She saw him reassess her, the woman he had purchased as a decorative necessity. He was seeing the strategist, the accountant. See to it, he said finally, his voice clipped. He did not offer praise, but in his world she was beginning to learn. Delegation was a form of trust. She did see to it. She met with the estate steward, Mr. Finch, a man who clearly resented her interference, but could not argue with her numbers. She wrote to new suppliers. she began to impose order on the chaos. And as she worked, she felt a flicker of her old self return. In the afternoons, when the numbers swam before her eyes, she would walk in the neglected garden. It was a wild tangle of thorns and weeds, but the ghosts of a magnificent design were still visible. An old man, the sole remaining gardener, watched her from a distance as she began, day by day, to clear the weeds from a bed of ancient, choking roses. She found a pair of old shears in a crumbling potting shed and began the painstaking work of cutting back the dead wood. The Duke watched her sometimes from the window of his study. She would feel his eyes on her back, a heavy, questioning gaze. He never spoke of it, but she knew he saw. The staff, too, began to change. Mrs. Gable's severity softened into a grudging respect. Mary began to chatter quietly as she brushed Alara's hair at night, sharing small pieces of village gossip. The house was still silent, but it was no longer empty. It was beginning to feel like a place where one could breathe. The estate office was a small, cold room adjacent to the Duke's study, filled with generations of paperwork. Alistair had given her unrestricted access, an unspoken acknowledgement of her competence. It was there, while attempting to organize a century of tenant agreements, that she found it. A heavy locked oak file box tucked away on the highest shelf, covered in a thick layer of dust. It was out of place amongst the land deeds and rent rolls. Curiosity, a feeling she had long suppressed, pricked at her. That evening she found the key. It was in a small lacquer box on the mantelpiece in the main library, mixed in with a collection of her husband's late father's personal effects, a signet ring, a pair of spectacles, a tarnished silver locket. The key was ornate, made of brass, and she knew instinctively it belonged to the box. Late that night, with the house settled into its deep silence, she returned to the office. The key turned smoothly in the lock. The contents were not estate papers. They were documents, letters, and promissory notes, all meticulously organized, all pertaining to the financial ruin of her father, Baron Vance. Her blood ran cold. She sank into the dusty chair, her hands trembling as she read. Here was the evidence of every loan, every foolish investment, every desperate measure her father had taken. And on the bottom of each document of debt, a deed of transfer, signed within the last 6 months. The debts had not been called in by a dozen different creditors. They had been bought, purchased quietly and systematically by one man, Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood. The floor seemed to drop out from beneath her. He hadn't just found her at the assembly, he had engineered her fall. He had manufactured her desperation, cornered her, and then plucked her from the ruin he himself had created. The cold indifference she had mistaken for honesty was a lie. It was the calculated patience of a predator. She did not wait until morning. She took the entire box and walked through the silent house, down the long corridor to the west wing, a place she had never been. She did not knock on the door to his study. She opened it and walked in. He was there, seated by a low fire, a glass of brandy in his hand. He looked up, his expression hardening at her intrusion, then softening into alarm when he saw her face. "Alara?" It was the first time he had used her given name. "What is this?" she asked, her voice shaking with a cold fury. She placed the box on the table between them. "What is the meaning of this?" He looked at the box, then back at her, and the mask of impenetrable control he wore every day cracked. For a moment she saw something that looked like regret. "You were not meant to find that," he said quietly. "You orchestrated it," she accused, her voice rising. "My family's ruin, my public humiliation, all of it. So you could acquire a wife cheaply, one with no connections to trouble you?" "No," he said, standing. "That is not how it was." "Then explain it," she cried, the carefully constructed walls of her composure crumbling. "Explain how you came to own every penny of my father's misery." He took a deep breath, his gaze unwavering. "Your former fiancé, Lord Ashworth," he began, his voice low and grave. "His father and my father were political rivals. The Ashworths were instrumental in a scandal that ruined a dear friend of mine years ago. I have been watching them ever since. I was investigating Ashworth's finances when I uncovered his arrangement with your father. He was not planning to marry you. He was planning to acquire your father's remaining assets, indebt him further, and then cast you aside for a true heiress, leaving your family utterly destitute." He gestured to the box. "I began buying the debts to gain leverage over him, to stop him. By the time I had control, your father had already made the public announcement. Your situation was a consequence I had not intended, but it was one I could not ignore." He looked at her, his pale eyes stripped of all their usual defenses. "I did not ruin you, Alara. I intervened. When I learned you had been sent to that place in London, I went there because I knew you were a victim of Ashworth's avarice. I knew you were intelligent. I knew you were honourable. I chose you not because you were cheap, but because you deserved better than to be destroyed by men like him." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and unbelievable. He had not been the architect of her despair, but a silent, unseen guardian. The truth was infinitely more complicated and more devastating than the lie she had believed. The first letter from Lord Ashworth arrived a week later on a silver tray. It was addressed to her, the new Duchess of Blackwood. The script was an arrogant, flowing hand she remembered well. It was a note of effusive and entirely false congratulation on her marriage, laced with thinly veiled insinuations. "I was so relieved to hear you had found a safe harbour," he wrote. "A man of the Duke's reputation can be so imposing. I trust you are being treated with the kindness you deserve." The threat was clear. He was watching, and he believed he still held some claim over her. Alara handed the letter to Alistair across the breakfast table without a word. He read it, his jaw tightening degree by degree until the muscles stood out in sharp relief. He did not comment, merely folded the paper and slipped it into his coat pocket. But a new tension had entered the house. The confrontation came, as it was always bound to, in public. At a small autumnal fete in the local village, an event Alara had insisted they attend to show goodwill to their tenants. They were inspecting a prize-winning sow when he appeared, his smile as polished and insincere as ever. "Your Grace, Duchess," Lord Ashworth said, bowing with a flourish that was almost a mockery. "How wonderful to see you out in society. I was beginning to worry you were being kept a prisoner in that great stone fortress of yours." Alistair's hand rested lightly on the small of Alara's back, a subtle gesture of possession and warning. "Ashworth," he said, his voice a shard of ice. "I wasn't aware you had any interests in this part of the country." "Oh, I have interests everywhere," Ashworth replied, his eyes lingering on Alara. "Especially in the welfare of old friends. Alara, you look, well, a bit pale, perhaps." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "If you ever find yourself in need of assistance, you know you can always rely on me." It was an act of public intimidation, an attempt to paint her as a victim and him as her would-be savior. In the past, Alara would have frozen, silenced by the audacity of his cruelty. But the woman who had balanced the Blackwood ledgers and faced down its master in his own study was no longer that girl. She met his gaze directly, her own voice cool and clear, drawing the attention of those nearby. "My welfare, Lord Ashworth, has never been of interest to you, except as it pertained to my father's finances," she said distinctly. "Your concern now is as unwelcome as it is transparent. She saw the flash of fury in his eyes before he masked it with a wounded expression. "My dear, you are overwrought. The Duke's influence, I fear." Alistair stepped forward, his height and stillness a palpable threat. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. "You will address my wife as Your Grace," he said, the words perfectly spaced and lethally quiet. "And you will not address her again. Is that understood?" Ashworth, for all his bluster, was a coward. He paled under the Duke's glacial stare, offered a clipped, furious bow, and retreated into the crowd. Alistair did not look at Ilara, but his hand remained on her back as he guided her away, a firm, steady pressure that said, "We face this together." They were not savior and rescued. They were allies. And for the first time, Ilara understood that the fortress of Blackwood might not be a prison, but a sanctuary. The confrontation with Ashworth left an echo in the silent halls of the manor, a disquiet that settled in the spaces between them. That evening, Ilara found herself in the library, unable to settle with a book, her mind replaying the scene at the fete. The fire was lit, casting long, dancing shadows over the spines of 1,000 silent stories. She was not surprised when Alistair entered. He often came here late at night, and they had developed a habit of sharing the room's deep silence, each seated in one of the large leather armchairs by the hearth. But tonight, the silence felt different, charged. He did not pick up a book. He walked to the fireplace, resting one arm on the marble mantelpiece, and stared down into the flames. The firelight caught the scars on his jaw, making them seem starker, deeper. Minutes passed. The only sound was the hiss and crackle of the logs. Finally he spoke, his voice low, not looking at her. He was wrong. "About you." Ilara looked up from the page she had not been reading. Her heart gave a slow, heavy beat. "In what way?" He turned his head then, and his pale, grey eyes met hers across the small space. They were clear, unguarded, holding an expression she had never seen before. "He saw you as a commodity, an asset to be acquired or discarded." He paused, and the admission that came next seemed to cost him something. "I confess, when I first sought a wife I saw the arrangement in a similar light, a solution to a problem, a name to fulfill a requirement." He looked away, back into the fire. "I was also wrong." The silence stretched again, but now it was filled with the weight of his unspoken words. Ilara waited. "You are not a solution," he said at last, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "You are the foundation. This house, it was a shell, a place of order and silence. You have brought it a current of life. You balanced the books, yes, but you also speak with the staff. You remembered the stable boy's name. You are tending the garden." He finally turned to face her fully, his expression one of stark, painful honesty. "I had forgotten what it was to have a partner. I did not believe it was possible." He took a step toward her chair. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. She did not move, did not look away. He stopped before her and slowly, hesitantly reached out a hand. He did not take her hand. Instead, his fingers brushed gently against the back of her hand where it rested on the arm of the chair. It was the slightest of touches, a contact so light it was barely there, but it sent a shock of warmth through her entire body. "Ilara," he said, his voice barely a whisper, and in that single word she heard everything he could not say. The years of loneliness, the fortress of his heart, the wall that was, at long last, beginning to crumble. The invitation to the Duchess of Wellington's annual masquerade ball was a command performance. It was the pinnacle of the London season, and for the reclusive Duke of Blackwood to attend with his new, mysterious Duchess was a guaranteed source of intense speculation. Alistair had been adamant. "Ashworth will be there," he'd stated, not as a warning, but as a strategic assessment. He will attempt to finish what he started. We will not let him. For the occasion, Elara had a gown made not of plain wool or sensible cotton, but of midnight blue silk that shimmered like a starless sky. When she descended the grand staircase of their London townhouse, Alistair was waiting at the bottom. He was in formal black evening wear, stark and severe, but as he looked up at her, his composure fractured. For a moment he simply stared, his expression one of pure, unguarded admiration. He offered his arm, his touch firm and steady. "You are magnificent," he murmured, for her ears alone. The ballroom was a dazzling crush of jewels, silks, and whispered gossip. Behind their simple black masks, they were the focus of every eye. They danced the first waltz, moving together with a grace and synchronicity that surprised them both. It was as if they had done this 100 times before. In the circle of his arms, with the world watching, Elara felt profoundly, unshakably safe. Ashworth found them near the champagne fountain. He was dressed as a preening courtier, his mask adorned with peacock feathers. "A stunning performance," he said, his voice slick with malice. "One might almost believe it were real." He raised his voice just enough for the surrounding guests to hear. But we all know the truth of these convenient arrangements, don't we? A desperate woman, a reclusive duke. I wonder what price was paid for such a swift and silent union. I, for one, know what promises were made to me and broken. The crowd fell into a listening hush. This was the moment of attack, the public trial he had been planning. Elara felt Alistair tense, but before he could speak, she stepped forward slightly, her voice ringing out with perfect clarity. "The only promise that was broken, Lord Ashworth, was the one you made to my father when you conspired to ruin him." Gasps rippled through the onlookers. Alistair moved to stand beside her, a united front. He produced a folded letter from his inner pocket, the letter Ashworth had written to her at Blackwood. "Lord Ashworth seems to have a selective memory," Alistair said, his voice carrying easily through the silent room. "Perhaps this will refresh it." He began to read aloud Ashworth's own words, the veiled threats, the proprietary tone, the arrogant assumption of his own welcome. He followed it with a calm, factual account of Ashworth's financial scheme against her father, presenting not accusations, but evidence. "My wife came to me with nothing but her name and her character," Alistair concluded, his gaze sweeping the crowd before settling on Elara. "She has since proven that her acumen is sharper than any man's in this room, and her integrity is worth more than the entire Ashworth fortune. She is not the Duchess by contract. She is the Duchess by merit. Any man who suggests otherwise is a liar and a scoundrel." The condemnation was absolute. Ashworth, his face a mottled red, was surrounded by a sea of cold, judging eyes. His social ruin was complete. Without another word, he turned and fled the ballroom. Alistair turned to Elara, took her hand, and raised it to his lips. In front of all of London society, he bowed his head to his wife. They returned to Blackwood as the first roses of spring were beginning to bloom. The garden, which had been a desolate tangle of thorns, was now a place of order and burgeoning life. Neat gravel paths wound between beds of carefully pruned rose bushes, their leaves a vibrant, healthy green. The air smelled of damp earth and the promise of flowers. It was a quiet Sunday morning. The house was peaceful, the staff moving with a relaxed efficiency that had been absent a year ago. Elara was in the garden, a pair of shears in her gloved hand, inspecting a climbing rose that was beginning to scale the old stone wall. She heard his footsteps on the path behind her, but didn't turn. He came to stand beside her, his presence a familiar comfort. For a long while, they simply stood together, looking at the work of her hands. "The roses have taken well," he said. It was a simple statement, but it held the weight of everything that had passed between them. He was not just talking about the flowers. He was talking about her, about them, about the life they had built in this once empty place. "I had a good gardener," she replied, a small smile touching her lips. He reached out and took the shears from her hand, setting them carefully on a stone bench. Then he took her hand in his fingers lacing through hers, his touch no longer hesitant, but sure and certain. The leather of her glove was soft against his bare skin. "This house was a fortress, Alara," he said, his voice quiet and reflective. "I built the walls so high I could no longer see the sun. You did not tear them down. You simply planted a garden inside them." She looked from their joined hands up to the house. The windows of the south wing were unshuttered, the glass gleaming, catching the morning light. It was no longer a place of shadows and ghosts. It was a home. "I thought it was a contract," she whispered, looking at him. "A transaction, a means of survival." "It was," he agreed, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "And then it became something else." He met her gaze, his pale eyes full of a warmth she now knew was reserved only for her. "It became real." "Yes," she said, her heart full. It was not a question, but a confirmation. "We made it so." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. They stood there for a long time in the quiet of the morning, in the heart of the garden they had restored together. Two solitary people who had entered into a cold bargain and found, against all odds, that it had led them home. What had been transactional had become true. What was broken had become whole. What was discarded had become essential. Thank you for joining us on this journey to Blackwood Manor. We have to ask, would you have trusted a man who held all your family's secrets? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and please tell us where you're watching from today. It seems the most enduring alliances are sometimes the ones that begin as the most honest transactions.